Imagine a man who unified an entire continent, revived culture and education, and became the first emperor of the Western world in centuries. He was crowned by the Pope himself, but his story is far more than just a title. Who was Charlemagne? Why is he considered the father of Europe? And how did his actions shape the world we know today? Get ready for a journey through the life of one of history's greatest leaders. In the year 742, in a world shattered by the fall of the Roman Empire, Charlemagne was born. He didn't just conquer territories, he sparked a cultural and educational renaissance that illuminated the Dark Ages. His legacy is so monumental that to this day, he's remembered as the founder of the Carolingian Empire and one of the pillars of modern Europe. Did you know that Charlemagne could barely write his name, yet he established schools across his vast empire? Or that his court collected and preserved ancient texts that would have otherwise been lost to history? The man who would change the course of European history began his journey in a time when knowledge was fading and chaos reigned. When Charlemagne took power, Europe was a patchwork of warring kingdoms with little unity or central authority. The glory of Rome was but a distant memory, and the continent was drifting through what many call the Dark Ages. But this remarkable leader had a vision that extended far beyond conquest. If you love history and want to uncover the mysteries of the great empires like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we dive deeper into the fascinating story of the man who laid the foundation for what would eventually become modern Europe. Let's talk about how a young Frank became the most powerful man in Europe. Charlemagne wasn't born into obscurity. He came from the mighty Frankish family that already controlled significant portions of what we now call France and Germany. His father, Pepin the Short, had established their dynasty after deposing the last of the Merovingian kings, rulers who had lost real power generations earlier while retaining their titles. When Pepin died in 768, the Frankish kingdom was divided between his two sons, Charlemagne, and his younger brother, Carloman. This was the customary Frankish practice, but it created immediate tension between the brothers. They were like oil and water from the start. While Charlemagne was charismatic and bold, his brother was cautious and suspicious. For 3 years, the brothers ruled their separate territories in an uneasy alliance. There were whispers at court of potential civil war brewing. The situation grew so tense that their mother, Bertrada, often had to intervene as peacemaker. Imagine the family dinners. Then fate intervened. In 771, Carloman suddenly died. Some historians speculate it was from a nosebleed, while others suggest illness. Whatever the cause, Charlemagne didn't waste a moment. Instead of recognizing Carloman's young sons as heirs, he swiftly moved to claim his brother's territories, forcing Carloman's widow and children to flee to the Lombard kingdom in Italy for protection. With the Frankish kingdom now united under his sole rule, Charlemagne's true ambition revealed itself. He launched a series of military campaigns that would transform the map of Europe. What made these conquests truly remarkable wasn't just their scope, but their speed. Imagine traveling in the 8th century. No cars, no phones, no modern roads. Yet Charlemagne managed to lead armies across thousands of miles, from the Pyrenees to the plains of Hungary. His most brutal and lengthy conquest was against the Saxons, a pagan people to the northeast of Francia. This war lasted over 30 years and saw Charlemagne employ tactics that would be considered war crimes today, including the execution of thousands of Saxon prisoners in a single day at Verdun. It was a dark chapter that reveals how determined Charlemagne was to expand his Christian kingdom, regardless of the cost. But military prowess was only part of Charlemagne's genius. He was equally skilled in diplomacy and administration. He didn't just conquer territories, he transformed them into a cohesive empire. He installed loyal counts to govern distant regions, sent royal representatives called Missi Dominici to ensure his laws were enforced, and began to standardize currency, weights, and measures across his growing realm. By the time he turned 50, Charlemagne had expanded the Frankish kingdom into an empire that encompassed most of Western Europe, something that hadn't existed since the fall of Rome 3 centuries earlier. The stage was set for him to claim a title that would forever change European history. Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror with a sharp sword, he was a visionary with an even sharper mind. By the end of the 8th century, he had assembled an empire unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. The Carolingian Empire, named after Charlemagne's family name Carolus, stretched across what we now know as France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, and parts of Spain. Just imagine ruling a territory that vast in an age when the fastest message could only travel as quickly as a horse could gallop. But the most dramatic moment in Charlemagne's reign, and perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in European history, came on Christmas Day in the year 800. Picture this scene: Rome, the eternal city, once the center of the greatest empire the Western world had known. Inside the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica, Charlemagne kneels in prayer during the Christmas Mass. The air is thick with incense, the space illuminated by hundreds of candles. Suddenly, Pope Leo III approaches him with a golden crown. What happened next changed the course of history. As Charlemagne rose from prayer, the Pope placed the crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The congregation erupted in 3 thunderous acclamations. Long life and victory to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. According to Charlemagne's own biographer, Einhard, the king later claimed he had no idea this was going to happen. He supposedly said that had he known the Pope's intentions, he would not have entered the church that day, despite it being the most significant feast of the Christian calendar. Was this genuine surprise, or was it political theater? Many historians believe this was actually a carefully choreographed event planned between Charlemagne and the Pope, with the surprise element added to avoid appearing too power-hungry. Whether planned or spontaneous, this coronation held enormous significance. Think about it. For centuries, there had been just one Roman emperor ruling from Constantinople in the east. Now suddenly, there were 2, one in the east and one in the west. This coronation effectively split the concept of Rome in 2, creating a rivalry that would shape European politics for centuries. For the Pope, this move was brilliant. Leo III had recently faced a violent uprising in Rome and needed Charlemagne's protection. By crowning him emperor, the Pope established himself as the kingmaker, suggesting that papal approval was necessary for imperial legitimacy. It was a power play that would define church-state relations throughout the Middle Ages. For Charlemagne, the imperial title gave his diverse conquests a unified identity. He wasn't just a Frankish king anymore. He was the successor to Augustus and Constantine, the inheritor of Rome's glory. This wasn't just about prestige, it was about legitimacy. It transformed his empire from a collection of conquered territories into a divinely sanctioned restoration of Roman authority. The Carolingian Empire wasn't just vast, it was extraordinarily well organized for its time. Charlemagne established a central government at his capital in Aachen, where he built a magnificent palace complex with a chapel modeled after Byzantine churches. From this center, he sent out officials called Missi Dominici, literally envoys of the Lord Master, who traveled in pairs, usually a count and a bishop, to ensure his laws were being enforced fairly throughout the empire. One of the most fascinating aspects of Charlemagne's rule was his attempt to standardize everything from currency to measurements across his vast domains. He even tried to standardize handwriting. The clear, readable script developed during his reign, known as Carolingian minuscule, became so effective that it's actually the basis for the lowercase letters we use today. That's right, the way we write our alphabet was shaped by Charlemagne's desire for administrative efficiency. While Charlemagne's military conquests expanded his empire's borders, it was his cultural revolution that truly changed Europe's soul. Imagine a world where knowledge was fading, where ancient texts were being lost to time, where literacy was so rare that even kings could barely sign their names. This was the Europe Charlemagne inherited, a continent recovering from centuries of intellectual darkness after Rome's fall. But Charlemagne had a vision that went far beyond battlefields. He believed an empire needed more than just swords. It needed minds. And so began what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a remarkable revival of learning, arts, and culture that would light a candle in Europe's dark ages. Here's what makes this story so fascinating. Charlemagne himself couldn't read or write proficiently. According to his biographer Einhard, the emperor kept writing tablets under his pillow and would practice forming letters in his spare time, but he began too late in life to become truly literate. Yet this warrior king, who struggled with his own penmanship, became one of history's greatest patrons of education. Charlemagne began by gathering the greatest minds of his age to his court at Aachen. He recruited scholars from across Europe and beyond, England, Ireland, Italy, Spain, even as far as the Eastern Mediterranean. The most famous was an English monk named Alcuin of York, who became the intellectual architect of the Carolingian Renaissance. Together, these brilliant minds formed what some historians call the Palace School, though it wasn't a school in the modern sense, but rather a community of scholars. One of their most important projects was standardizing and correcting religious texts. Over centuries of hand copying, many manuscripts had accumulated errors or variations. Imagine playing a game of telephone across generations. That's what had happened to many important books. Charlemagne's scholars painstakingly compared different versions to create accurate editions of the Bible, liturgical texts, and church writings. But their ambitions went far beyond religious works. They sought out and preserved classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome that might otherwise have been lost forever. Many of the Roman and Greek classics we know today, works by Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, and others, survived largely because Carolingian scholars copied them. Think about that. Without Charlemagne's cultural program, we might have lost much of our connection to the ancient world. Even more revolutionary was Charlemagne's education mandate. In 789, he issued a decree called the Admonitio Generalis, which ordered that every cathedral and monastery should establish schools to teach not just future priests, but also ordinary children how to read and write. This was unprecedented, the first attempt at widespread public education in Western Europe since the Roman Empire. The Carolingian scholars also revolutionized how books looked. They developed a new form of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule, which was clearer and easier to read than earlier scripts. They introduced spaces between words and punctuation marks, features we take for granted today but were innovations then. They even created a new way of organizing information on the page that made books more accessible and usable. Beyond literature, Charlemagne promoted architecture, art, and music. He built magnificent structures like the Palace Chapel at Aachen, which still stands today, blending Roman and Byzantine styles into something uniquely Carolingian. He standardized church music, spreading what we now call Gregorian chant throughout his empire. His court became a center for beautiful illuminated manuscripts, ivory carvings, and metalwork. The most remarkable aspect of this Renaissance is that it happened during constant warfare and in an age of limited resources. While leading campaigns against Saxons, Avars, or Lombards, Charlemagne was simultaneously corresponding with scholars about acquiring rare manuscripts or establishing new schools. He saw no contradiction between conquest and culture. In his mind, both were essential to rebuilding civilization. Did you know that Charlemagne was so passionate about education that he encouraged even his battle-hardened soldiers to study? That's right. The emperor, who commanded fierce warriors across Europe, also expected them to appreciate learning. While we don't know if his grizzled veterans actually picked up books between battles, this detail speaks volumes about Charlemagne's values. So are you enjoying this video? If you're fascinated by how one man's vision could transform a continent, give this video a thumbs up, share it with your history-loving friends, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from the past. And tell us in the comments, which aspect of Charlemagne's life has impressed you the most? Was it his military conquests, his imperial coronation, or this remarkable cultural renaissance? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's step away from the grand conquests and cultural revolutions for a moment and get to know Charlemagne, the man. When we think of medieval rulers, we often imagine them as distant figures lost in the fog of history, but thanks to his loyal biographer Einhard, we have fascinating glimpses into Charlemagne's personal life that make him leap off the pages of history. First, let's talk about his physical appearance. In an age when the average man stood around 5 feet 4 inches tall, Charlemagne towered over his contemporaries at 6 feet and 1 inch. When archaeologists examined what they believed to be his remains, they confirmed he was unusually tall for his time. Imagine the psychological impact when this giant of a man, adorned in royal regalia, entered a room. His mere presence commanded attention and respect before he even spoke a word. And speaking of his appearance, Charlemagne had a distinctive look. He sported a rounded belly, a thick neck, and a flowing mustache. Though interestingly, he did not have the long beard often depicted in later artwork. He had a high-pitched voice that somewhat contrasted with his imposing figure and piercing eyes that Einhard described as large and lively. Charlemagne was a man of robust appetites and strict habits. He loved hunting and was an excellent swimmer, so good in fact that no one at his court could match him. He particularly adored the natural hot springs at Aachen, which is precisely why he established his capital there. Charlemagne would regularly invite friends, courtiers, even his sons and bodyguards, to join him for a dip in these thermal baths, where some of his most important political discussions took place in the steaming waters. Imagine important matters of state being decided while the emperor and his advisors relaxed in the hot springs. Despite enjoying feasts, Charlemagne was surprisingly moderate in his eating and especially his drinking. He despised drunkenness and limited himself to 3 cups of wine with meals. He was particularly fond of roasted meat served on the spit, though his physicians often tried to convince him to eat boiled meat instead, which they considered healthier. His daily routine was remarkably disciplined. He rose before dawn, attended to imperial business, and then went to church, sometimes multiple times a day. He dressed simply in the Frankish style, with linen shirts and drawers, a silk-fringed tunic, and a blue cloak. He wore a sword with a gold or silver hilt as part of his daily attire, and only donned more elaborate clothes for special ceremonies or when meeting foreign dignitaries. Family was central to Charlemagne's life, though his domestic arrangements were certainly complex by modern standards. He had 5 wives in succession and several concubines, fathering about 18 children that we know of. Despite the political nature of many of his marriages, he was genuinely devoted to his family. He kept his daughters close to him at court and was reluctant to let them marry, preferring their company to sending them off to form political alliances. Perhaps the most touching aspect of Charlemagne's personal life was his love of learning and storytelling. Though he struggled with writing himself, he would have ancient heroic poems recited at dinner and always kept scholars by his side. He studied grammar, rhetoric, astronomy, and mathematics with the learned men of his court. He was particularly fascinated by the works of St. Augustine, especially The City of God, which was often read aloud to him during meals. Music held a special place in Charlemagne's heart. He reformed church singing, imported musicians from Rome to teach the proper ways of chanting, and would even conduct the royal chapel choir himself, occasionally with a small baton. Imagine being a singer with the emperor himself as your conductor. One of my favorite anecdotes about Charlemagne concerns his educational efforts. There's a story that he once visited a palace school and reviewed the work of students from different social classes. He found that the students from humble backgrounds had worked diligently and produced excellent results, while the nobly born students had been lazy and accomplished little. Charlemagne gathered the hard-working commoner students on his right, praised them effusively, and promised them future positions in his administration. Then he turned to the noble slackers on his left, scolded them severely, and warned them they would receive nothing from him unless they improved. This emperor valued merit over birth, a revolutionary concept for the 8th century. Even on campaign, Charlemagne brought scholars with him to continue his studies. Picture this: a war tent on the Saxon frontier, filled with maps and weapons, and in the corner, the Emperor of Western Europe listening intently as a monk explains the movements of the planets or the finer points of theological arguments. This was a ruler who believed the mind needed exercise as much as the body. On January 28, 814, Europe lost its greatest ruler. Charlemagne, at the age of about 72, died after developing a fever following a plunge in his beloved thermal baths at Aachen. The man who had dominated the continent for more than 4 decades was gone. As he drew his final breath, could he have imagined how profoundly his life would shape the world for centuries to come? According to the court records, the signs of his death were dramatic. There had been frequent solar and lunar eclipses in the year prior. The palace portico at Aachen had collapsed. The wooden bridge over the Rhine at Mainz, which had taken 10 years to build, burned down in 3 hours. Some even reported seeing a black cross appear in the sky. Medieval chroniclers loved to attach cosmic significance to the deaths of great rulers, and in Charlemagne's case, perhaps these omens were fitting. His death truly was a world-changing event. The emperor was buried that same day in the Palatine chapel he had built at Aachen. Legend says he was entombed, seated on a throne, dressed in his imperial robes, with a crown on his head and a copy of the Gospels in his hands. When his tomb was opened centuries later by Emperor Otto III, in the year 1000, they supposedly found him just as he had been buried, like an emperor merely waiting through the centuries. Charlemagne's carefully constructed empire didn't long survive him intact. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited the entire realm, but after Louis died, the empire was divided among his 3 squabbling sons in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This division created the rough outlines of what would eventually become France and Germany, setting the stage for much of European history that followed. In a very real sense, the modern map of Western Europe begins with the fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire. But while his political unity crumbled, his deeper influences endured. The feudal system, which would dominate European social organization for centuries, took much of its shape under Charlemagne. His practice of rewarding followers with lands and titles in exchange for military service became the blueprint for medieval society. His administrative innovations, the use of counts, the sending of royal inspectors, the holding of assemblies, established governance patterns that would last for generations. Charlemagne's influence on European culture was even more lasting than his political legacy. The Carolingian Renaissance sparked an intellectual revival that never completely died out. The monasteries and schools he established continued to preserve and transmit knowledge. The standardized script his scholars developed, Carolingian minuscule, evolved into the lowercase letters we still use today. Think about that. Every time you read or write a lowercase letter, you're experiencing a small part of Charlemagne's legacy. His impact on the Christian Church was equally profound. By supporting the papacy, standardizing religious practices, and spreading Christianity eastward, he helped cement the Church's central role in European life. The concept of a Christian Europe that would dominate medieval thought was largely Charlemagne's creation. Perhaps most fascinating is how Charlemagne became a legendary figure almost immediately after his death. Already by the 12th century, fabulous stories circulated about him. He became the central hero of the Matter of France, a body of epic literature that includes the famous Song of Roland, Dre. In these tales, Charlemagne is often portrayed as 300 years old, with a flowing white beard, leading crusades that the historical Charlemagne never participated in. He became less a historical figure and more a symbol of ideal Christian kingship. This mythologizing crossed into the realm of religion when Charlemagne was canonized as a saint in the 12th century. Though this canonization was authorized by an anti-pope and later recognized only as a blessed person by some parts of the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, for centuries, his feast day was celebrated on January 28th in parts of Europe. Charlemagne's legacy extends even into modern European politics. When the precursor to the European Union was being formed after World War II, the Charlemagne Prize was established to recognize individuals who contributed to European unity. To this day, it remains one of Europe's most prestigious awards, given in Aachen, Charlemagne's favored city. When French President Macron and German Chancellor Merkel signed a new friendship treaty in 2019, they did so in Aachen's town hall, a deliberate nod to Charlemagne's legacy of Franco-German cooperation. Perhaps most remarkably, Charlemagne remains a unifying figure despite the complex history that followed him. Both France and Germany claim him as a founding father. His capital at Aachen, today's Aachen in Germany, lies just miles from the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands, a geographical embodiment of his cross-border significance. In a continent that would be torn apart by nationalism in later centuries, Charlemagne represents a shared European heritage that transcends modern boundaries. What makes a legacy truly great is not just its immediate impact, but its lasting resonance. By this measure, Charlemagne's imprint on history is almost unparalleled. More than 12 centuries after his death, we still feel the effects of his reign in our politics, our writing, our educational systems, and our concept of Europe itself. Few lives have ever mattered so much for so long. The French writer and philosopher Voltaire perhaps summed it up best when he said, "The empire of Charlemagne was nothing but a flash of lightning, but that flash came from the heavens." A flash that, all these centuries later, still illuminates our world. As we come to the end of our journey through the remarkable life of Charlemagne, let's reflect on what this extraordinary figure can teach us. Charlemagne was indeed far more than just a conqueror with a sharp sword and a thirst for territory. He was a visionary who reimagined what Europe could be during a time when most could barely see beyond the next harvest or the next battle. In an age of darkness, he sought light. In an era of fragmentation, he created unity. When knowledge was disappearing, he built schools and libraries to preserve it. This warrior king understood something profound that many leaders throughout history have missed. That true power lies not just in conquering lands, but in conquering hearts and minds. Consider this. 12 centuries have passed since Charlemagne drew his last breath, yet we still speak his name. Countries still trace their origins to his empire. The educational institutions he championed evolved into the university system that transformed human knowledge. The religious unity he promoted, while certainly complicated by modern standards, helped forge a shared European identity that transcended tribal loyalties. What can we learn from this towering figure who straddled the ancient and medieval worlds? Perhaps it's that leadership requires both strength and wisdom. Charlemagne could be ruthless on the battlefield, yet thoughtful in governance. He could command armies while valuing education. He could wield absolute power while seeking counsel from the brightest minds of his age. Or maybe the lesson is about vision, the ability to see beyond immediate problems, to imagine a better future. While his contemporaries were focused on survival, Charlemagne was building an empire and a renaissance. He looked back to Rome's glory not out of nostalgia, but as inspiration for what could be built anew. Perhaps what we can learn most from Charlemagne is that transformative change rarely comes from timid steps. His bold actions, creating schools, standardizing currency, reviving imperial traditions, preserving ancient knowledge, required courage and conviction. They also required believing in something greater than himself, a legacy that would outlive him. As we navigate our own complex world with its challenges and divisions, Charlemagne's example reminds us that walls can be replaced with bridges, that darkness can give way to enlightenment, and that even after the collapse of civilizations, new ones can rise from the ruins if there are leaders with the courage to imagine them. What do you think we can learn from Charlemagne's life? Was it his balance of might and mind, his appreciation for education despite his own limitations, his ability to unite diverse peoples, or perhaps his understanding that true legacies are built not just on conquest, but on culture? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know which aspect of this extraordinary life resonated most with you. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of history's most influential figures, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel reach more history enthusiasts like yourself. Share this video with friends who appreciate how the past shapes our present. And don't forget to subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more journeys into the fascinating stories of the Middle Ages. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next adventure through time. Until our next historical journey together, remember that we all have the power to leave legacies that outlive us, perhaps not as grand as Charlemagne's empire, but meaningful in their own way. Thank you for joining me in exploring the life of the man who earned the title Father of Europe. See you in our next video.